The clock glowed 3:47 a.m. when Margaret Robertson heard God whisper through her racing heart. If you're a Christian woman over 50 who knows this hour too, well, when anxiety feels like worship and rest feels like sin, this is your story. This is about discovering soul flowing, the divine rhythm you've been fighting your whole life. Margaret was 56, 2 years widowed, waking every night at exactly 3:47, with chest pains that mimicked David's final moments. She'd been everyone's rock, the prayer warrior, the caregiver, the one who never needed help. Until the morning she found herself on the bathroom floor, unable to remember the last time she'd truly rested without guilt. That's when Ruth, the 73-year-old church janitor, introduced her to something called soul flowing, not another spiritual discipline to master, but a surrender to the rhythm God had been whispering all along. Over the next 40 days, you'll witness Margaret's transformation from burnout to biblical rest, from grinding to flowing. You'll discover why 3:47 a.m. isn't a curse but an invitation, why rest isn't weakness but worship, and how soul flowing can restore what hustle faith has stolen. MIT research shows women's spiritual clarity peaks at age 57, right when the world tells you you're invisible. It's time to become visible to yourself again. The bathroom tiles were ice against Margaret's cheek at 3:47 a.m. The same time David's heart had stopped beating 2 years ago. She could taste copper in her mouth, fear or exhaustion. She couldn't tell anymore. The house groaned with the weight of silence, every creak a reminder that she was utterly devastatingly alone with a God who felt more distant than the stars visible through the skylight David had installed for their 30th anniversary. "This isn't prayer anymore," she whispered to the darkness, her voice cracking like dried leather. The realization hit harder than the chest pains. She'd been performing faith for so long, she'd forgotten what believing actually felt like. Christian women over 50 weren't supposed to admit this, that sometimes faith feels like drowning in expectations while everyone watches you smile. But here, on this cold floor, with her heart racing and her soul empty, Margaret finally spoke the truth that would begin everything. Her phone buzzed with Sarah's text from Seattle. "Mom, you okay? Something woke me up." The synchronicity should have been comforting, but it only highlighted the canyon between who Margaret pretended to be and who she'd become. She'd raised 3 children to love Jesus, taught Sunday school for 20 years, led the prayer chain since David's promotion to glory. Yet here she was, the spiritual matriarch, Googling what does a female heart attack feel like while her Bible collected dust on the nightstand. The mirror reflected a stranger hollow eyes, gray roots showing David's flannel robe hanging off shoulders that had carried everyone else's burdens until they'd forgotten how to set them down. This wasn't the vibrant woman who'd once led worship with such passion that people wept. This was someone drowning in the very faith that was supposed to be her life raft. She needed to find her morning routine with God again, but first, she had to admit she'd lost it completely. Tomorrow would bring another performance, another day of being strong for everyone while dying inside. But tonight, at 3:47 a.m., Margaret Robertson finally admitted the truth that would crack her open for grace. She was a Christian woman over 50, experiencing complete spiritual burnout, and she had no idea how to stop the grinding and start flowing. But that confession, that was the beginning of soul flowing, though she didn't know it yet. Margaret's journal entry from that morning read like a prosecution. "I should be stronger than this. I should trust more. I should pray better. I should be over David's death by now. I should. The pen had torn through the paper on the last word, leaving a hole that perfectly represented her faith damaged by the violence of trying too hard. She'd been shooting on herself for 2 years, each should another brick in the prison she'd built from religious expectations. "Your mother called again," Ruth mentioned while arranging the altar flowers, her weathered hands working with surprising grace. "Said you missed the prayer meeting. That's not like you, child." Ruth had been the church janitor for 15 years. But Margaret suspected she saw more from her mop bucket than the pastors did from the pulpit. "Sometimes I think we Christian women over 50 wear should like a crown of thorns. Forgetting Jesus already wore one, so we don't have to." The words landed like lightning in Margaret's chest, illuminating a truth she'd been avoiding. She'd turned faith into a performance review where she was always failing. Even now, sitting in the empty sanctuary, she was cataloging her spiritual failures: inconsistent quiet time, wandering thoughts during prayer, the secret resentment toward God for taking David. The weight of trying to earn what was freely given was literally crushing her. The doctor had confirmed her chest pains were stress-induced, her body keeping score of battles her soul was losing. Sarah's voice echoed from yesterday's call. "Mom, you sound exhausted. When did faith become such hard work?" The question had made Margaret angry because it exposed the lie she'd been living. Somewhere between David's funeral and last Tuesday, she'd forgotten that grace meant not having to be strong enough. She'd been trying to manufacture spiritual productivity through sheer will. But overcoming burnout as a Christian meant admitting that willpower was actually the problem, not the solution. That afternoon, Margaret found herself in David's study, untouched since his death except for dusting. Hidden behind his concordance was a journal she'd never seen. His handwriting on the cover: "When grinding becomes the enemy of grace." The first entry was dated 10 years ago. "I'm watching Maggie slowly die from trying to be the perfect Christian woman. Lord, show her what I'm only now learning, that you're not looking for performance, you're looking for presence." Real faith flows. It doesn't grind. But Margaret wouldn't understand what David meant about flowing until she hit bottom 3 days later. The call came at 2 a.m. Her mother had fallen again, this time breaking her hip. By 3:47 a.m., Margaret was in the hospital corridor, still wearing David's robe over her pajamas, trying to be everyone's everything while running on empty. The fluorescent lights exposed what the bathroom mirror had hidden. She was a woman disappearing under the weight of caring for everyone except herself. Her mother needed her, Sarah needed her, the church needed her, but who needed Margaret? "You look like death warmed over," Dr. Patricia Chen said bluntly, pulling Margaret aside after examining her mother. "When's the last time you slept through the night? Actually slept, not just laid there making mental lists." The question hung in the antiseptic air like an accusation. Margaret couldn't remember. Since David's death, she'd become the family crisis manager, the one everyone called first, the strong one who never needed help, a role that was literally killing her. 3 hours later, coordinating her mother's surgery while fielding texts from church about Sunday's potluck, Margaret felt something snap inside, not dramatically, but quietly, like a violin string worn too thin. She excused herself to the bathroom and found herself unable to cry, unable to scream, unable to feel anything except a vast, terrifying emptiness. This was what soul flowing would later heal, but right now it felt like spiritual death. She was a Christian woman over 50 who'd given herself away in pieces until there was nothing left. Her phone displayed 17 unread messages, each one another request, another need, another emergency that somehow required her immediate attention. The prayer chain needed updates. Sarah needed advice about her marriage. The church treasurer needed last month's mission receipts. Everyone needed Margaret, but Margaret needed something she couldn't even name until Ruth appeared in the hospital corridor like an angel in sensible shoes, took one look at her, and said, "Child, even Jesus went away to rest. What makes you think you're stronger than God?" The question shattered Margaret's last defense. She collapsed into Ruth's arms, David's robe slipping off her shoulders, and sobbed for the first time since the funeral. Through her tears, she heard Ruth whisper, "There's another way, honey. It's called soul flowing. It's for women like us who've forgotten that biblical rest for women isn't selfish, it's sacred. But first, you have to stop trying to be everyone's savior. That position's already filled." Tomorrow, Margaret would begin learning what that meant. "I feel guilty when I rest," Margaret admitted to her reflection at 3:47 a.m., the words tasting like betrayal. Good Christian women didn't rest while others suffered. They pushed through, pressed on, persevered. She'd been taught that exhaustion was next to godliness, that the more depleted you were, the more spiritual you must be. But here's what nobody tells Christian women over 50. Sometimes, The guilt you feel isn't conviction, it's conditioning from a religious system that thrives on your burnout. The guilt had tentacles reaching back 30 years. Every women's Bible study she'd attended had celebrated the Proverbs 31 woman who never seemed to sleep, who worked from dawn to dusk, who was everyone's everything. Nobody mentioned she was probably having panic attacks at 3:47 a.m. to Margaret had internalized the message that her worth to God was directly proportional to her exhaustion level. Rest equaled laziness. Self-care equaled selfishness. Saying no equaled spiritual failure. Ruth's words from the hospital kept echoing. Guilt and conviction aren't the same thing, child. Conviction leads to change. Guilt just leads to chains. Margaret opened her Bible, hoping for comfort. But every verse felt like another should. Another standard she was failing to meet. Even the promise of rest in Matthew 11 felt conditional. Come to me, all who are weary, but first make sure you've earned the right to be tired. The toxic mixture of faith and guilt had become so familiar, she couldn't taste the poison anymore. Sarah's call interrupted her spiral. Mom, you sound worse than yesterday. I'm worried about you. The concern in her daughter's voice broke something loose in Margaret's chest. I don't know how to stop, she heard herself confess. I don't know how to rest without feeling like I'm failing God, failing Dad's memory, failing everyone who needs me. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Sarah's response surprised her. Mom, what if God's not asking you to be strong? What if He's asking you to be real? That afternoon, Margaret did something she'd never done before. She canceled her commitments. The prayer meeting would survive without her. The potluck would happen whether she brought her famous casserole or not. She sat in David's study, reading his hidden journal, and discovered entry after entry about his own struggle with religious performance. The final entry, dated the week before his heart attack. I've discovered something called soul flowing, being productive from rest, not for rest. Maggie needs this. We both do. Finding purpose after 50 isn't about doing more. It's about flowing with what God's already doing. But first, we have to let go of the guilt that tells us we're never enough. If only he'd shared this while he was alive. The kitchen floor was cold against Margaret's face at 3:47 a.m. When her body finally staged the revolt her soul had been planning for months. The chest pain wasn't subtle this time. It was a crushing weight that drove her to her knees between the island and the refrigerator. Right where David used to make his midnight sandwiches. She couldn't reach her phone, couldn't call for help, could only lie there, wondering if this was how David felt in his final moments, alone with his failing heart. Please, she whispered to the ceiling, not sure if she was asking to live or permission to let go. The prayer felt different than her usual performances, raw, desperate, real. No King James vocabulary, no proper theological framework, just a woman on linoleum at 3:47 a.m. Finally understanding that she'd been dying long before this moment. The chest pain was just her body's way of making visible what had been happening invisibly for 2 years. A slow spiritual death by religious performance. Through the kitchen window, she saw Ruth's porch light flicker on across the street at 3:47 a.m. The synchronicity felt like God winking through her terror. Somehow, impossibly, Ruth appeared at Margaret's door 5 minutes later, with a key Margaret didn't remember giving her, finding her on the floor, not calling 911, but sitting down beside her, placing Margaret's head in her lap like a mother would. Breathe with me, child. This isn't a heart attack. It's your soul trying to break free from all that grinding. Ruth's voice became an anchor. Feel that? Your heart's strong, just tired of pretending. You've been practicing faith-based productivity, without the faith part, just the productivity. Your body's forcing you to stop, because your spirit won't. She stroked Margaret's gray roots with surprising tenderness. 20 years ago, I was on this same floor, different house, same collapse. That's when I learned about soul flowing, not from a book or sermon, but from finally breaking enough to let God in through the cracks. Margaret's breathing slowly steadied, the chest pain receding like a tide. Ruth helped her sit up against the dishwasher. David's robe pulled around them both. Tomorrow, you start learning what I learned, Ruth said, pulling out a worn journal from her bag. But tonight, You just accomplished the hardest part of finding purpose. After 50, you finally stopped trying to hold it all together. That's where soul flowing begins, honey, right here on the kitchen floor at 3:47 a.m., where all the real conversations with God happen. Welcome to the fellowship of women who've learned that falling apart is sometimes how we fall into grace. The church lie that kills women's faith. Ruth began the next morning, sitting in Margaret's kitchen with 2 cups of chamomile tea, is that God only speaks in churches. Truth is, he speaks louder in your kitchen at 3 a.m. than in most Sunday services. That's soul-flowing learning to hear God in the interruptions, not just the institutions. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for her cup, still shaky from last night's collapse. Ruth opened her worn journal, pages yellowed with age and tears. See this? 20 years of 3:47 a.m. conversations with God. Started the night my husband left me for his secretary. I was 53, pastoring everyone else through their crises, while mine stayed hidden. She turned to a specific page, here November 15, 2004. God interrupted my suicide planning with a burned-out light bulb, had to change it. The new light illuminated David's old devotional. Opening page. When you can't hold on, that's when you learn to flow. That was my first glimpse of what soul flowing meant. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, not pain this time, but possibility. But I've been a Christian for 40 years. How did I miss this? Ruth's laugh was knowing, gentle. Because we Christian women over 50 were taught that God interrupts sinners, not saints. We learned to schedule him into quiet times instead of recognizing he's already in every interruption. Your 3:47 wake-ups, that's not insomnia, honey. That's God saying, finally, you're quiet enough to hear me. The doorbell rang. Sarah, unexpected, still in her business suit, despite it being Saturday. Mom, I took the red-eye. We need to talk about your health, about getting you help, maybe medication for the anxiety. She stopped mid-sentence, seeing Ruth. Mrs. Ruth, what are you doing here? Ruth stood, gathering her journal. Teaching your mama what you both need to learn, that God's not looking for perfect Christian women. He's looking for present ones. And sometimes, his presence feels like interruption, until you learn it's actually invitation. Sarah's facade cracked slightly. I wake up at 3:47 too, she admitted quietly. Have been since Dad died. Thought it was just grief. Ruth placed a weathered hand on each of their shoulders. It's not grief, child. It's God interrupting your grinding to teach you flowing. Tomorrow morning, both of you meet me at the church at 4:30 a.m., not for prayer meeting, for something better. You're about to discover why spiritual growth after 50 doesn't come from doing more, but from flowing with what he's already doing. And Margaret, that biblical rest for women we talked about. It starts with letting God interrupt your plans. He's been trying to for 2 years. At 4:30 a.m., the church was different, empty, honest, free from performance. Ruth had lit candles in the sanctuary, their flickering light making the space feel ancient, sacred, real, soul-flowing. Ruth began, her voice echoing slightly. Isn't meditation, isn't yoga, isn't New Age nonsense. It's the rhythm God built into creation that we've forgotten. Even the ocean knows when to rush forward and when to pull back. But we Christian women, we only know how to rush. Margaret and Sarah sat in the front pew, both wrapped in blankets Ruth had brought. Watch this, Ruth said, walking to the piano. She played a simple melody, then stopped. Hear that? The silence between notes is what makes it music. Without pause, it's just noise. Your lives have become noise, constant doing, constant serving, constant performing. Soul flowing is learning to be the pause that makes life music again. She played the melody again, this time with deliberate rests. The difference was profound. In Exodus, God commanded Sabbath before he commanded love. Ruth continued. Think about that. Trust was more fundamental than relationship. Why? Because you can't love from empty. You can't serve from depletion. You can't find purpose after 50 if you're still grinding like you're 25. She pulled out a small bottle of oil. This is anointing oil, but watch. She turned the bottle upside down, trying to pour it out. Nothing came. See, even oil needs space to flow. When your life has no space, no pause, no rest. Nothing can flow, not love, not joy, not purpose. Sarah interrupted, her voice vulnerable. But my career, my marriage, Mom's health, there's no time for flowing. Ruth's response was gentle but firm. Child, you're drowning in time while starving for rhythm. Your 3:47 wake-ups aren't stealing your rest. They're revealing you never had it. Soul flowing isn't about finding more time. It's about flowing with the time you have. She turned the oil bottle right side up, removed the cap properly, and oil flowed freely. Same oil, different approach. That's what you're here to learn. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Not sad tears, but recognition. This is what David discovered, isn't it? In his journal. Ruth nodded. He found it 6 months before he died. Started practicing. Said it transformed his final months from grinding toward death to flowing toward glory. He wanted to teach you, but... She paused. But sometimes we have to collapse before we can flow. Your collapse, Margaret, isn't your ending, it's your beginning. Tomorrow, we start with the morning routine with God that changes everything. Not another discipline to master, but a rhythm to receive. This is soul flowing. Welcome to the dance you were made for. Sabbath isn't a day, it's a disposition, Ruth explained at 5 a.m. The sanctuary windows now showing hints of dawn. Jesus said Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath. But we Christian women over 50 turned it into another performance church clothes. Perfect attendance, exhausting Sunday dinners. That's not rest. That's religious theater. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, recognizing her entire Sunday routine in Ruth's words. The truth was sharp. Margaret's Sabbaths were her most exhausting days. Wake at 5 to prepare lunch, rush to early service, teach Sunday school, attend second service, host family dinner, clean until collapse. She'd thought she was honoring God with her service. But Ruth's next words shattered that illusion. You know what Jesus did on Sabbath? He healed, he ate with friends, he walked through grain fields, he flowed. He didn't perform rest, he inhabited it. That's the spiritual productivity he modeled, accomplishing more through rest than we ever could through grinding. Sarah pulled out her phone, showing her calendar. Look at this even, my rest days are scheduled. Yoga at 6, brunch at 10, meal prep at 2. I've turned rest into work. Ruth took the phone, deleted the entire Sunday schedule with one swipe. There. That's your first lesson in biblical rest for women. Sabbath isn't another thing to achieve. It's the space where God achieves things in you. But you have to create the space first. But people depend on me, Margaret protested, the old anxiety rising. The church expects. Ruth's interruption was gentle but firm. The church will survive without your casserole. Your family will survive making their own lunch. But you won't survive much longer trying to be everyone's Sabbath while never having your own. She opened her Bible to Mark 2:27. See, Sabbath was God's gift to you, not your gift to him. You've been regifting something meant for your healing. A memory surfaced. David on his last Sunday, sitting in the garden instead of helping with dinner preparations. Margaret had been irritated, thinking he was being lazy. Now she understood. He'd been practicing soul flowing. He'd discovered that finding purpose after 50 meant understanding Sabbath not as obligation but as invitation. Ruth stood, stretching. Your assignment this week, one true Sabbath. No cooking, no serving, no performing, just being. Watch how the world doesn't end when you stop holding it up. That's when you'll understand that Sabbath isn't about doing nothing, it's about letting God do everything. And that, my dear exhausted warriors, is the heart of soul flowing. Even prophets need naps, Ruth said, opening to 1 Kings 19. The worn pages falling open naturally. Elijah had just called down fire from heaven, defeated 450 prophets of Baal, performed the ultimate spiritual victory. And what did he do next? Ran to the desert, collapsed under a broom tree, and begged to die. Sound familiar? Margaret's breath caught it. Was exactly familiar, devastatingly familiar. The passage had always confused Margaret. How could God's mighty prophet be suicidal after such victory? Ruth's interpretation changed everything. Elijah had spiritual burnout. He'd been grinding for God so hard, he'd forgotten how to flow with God. And what was heaven's response? Not rebuke, not shame, not a pep talk about faith. God sent an angel with bread and water and said, "Sleep." The cure for prophet-level burnout was a nap and a snack. Let that sink in. Sarah leaned forward, tears streaming. I had my biggest career win last month, made partner at the firm. That night, I sat in my car for 3 hours, feeling nothing but empty. I thought something was wrong with me. Ruth reached across to squeeze her hand. Nothing's wrong, child. Everything's right. You're having your broom tree moment. The breakdown after the breakthrough. It's where Christian women over 50 learn that overcoming burnout as a Christian isn't about praying harder, it's about receiving the rest God's already provided. Ruth continued reading. After Elijah slept and ate, twice, only then did God speak. And it wasn't an earthquake or fire, it was in a whisper. You can't hear whispers when you're grinding. You can only hear them when you're flowing. She closed the Bible. Margaret, your 3:47 a.m. wake-ups, your kitchen floor collapse, that's your broom tree. And just like Elijah, God's not disappointed in your exhaustion. He's making space in it for soul flowing to begin. The revelation hit Margaret physically, her shoulders dropping as if releasing a weight she'd carried for years. So it's okay to be this tired. It's okay to want to quit. Ruth's response was fierce with compassion. It's not just okay, it's biblical. Every spiritual giant had a broom tree moment. Moses threw down his staff. Jonah had his tantrum. Peter went back to fishing. They all had to stop grinding before they could start flowing. Your exhaustion isn't failure. It's the doorway to a morning routine with God that actually restores instead of depletes. Tomorrow, you're going to sleep until your body wakes naturally. No alarm. No guilt. Just rest. If it was good enough for Elijah, it's good enough for you. Margaret's first attempt at stopping was a disaster. She'd turned off her alarm as instructed, but at 3:47 a.m., her eyes flew open anyway. By 4 a.m., she was making lists. By 4:30, she was answering emails. By 5, she was in full grinding mode, having turned rest into another task to master. Ruth found her at 7 a.m., exhausted from trying to rest perfectly. Honey, you just turned soul flowing into soul forcing. That's not how this works. I don't know how to stop, Margaret admitted, her voice breaking. My hands need to be busy. My mind needs to be solving. Even when I try to rest, I'm planning how to rest better. Ruth pulled out a tangled ball of yarn from her bag. See this? This is your soul right now. Watch. She didn't try to untangle it. Instead, she simply held it, breathing slowly, letting it be messy. Stopping isn't about fixing. It's about accepting. You've been a human doing for so long. You've forgotten how to be a human being. Sarah arrived with coffee and her own confession. I tried to rest yesterday. Set a timer for it. Scheduled doing nothing from 2 to 3 p.m. Made it 12 minutes before I was reorganizing my closet. Ruth laughed, not mockingly but with deep recognition. Of course you did. You're both trying to achieve rest instead of receive it. Faith-based productivity isn't about producing rest, it's about resting productively. There's a difference. Ruth led them through a simple exercise. Hold your breath. Go on, hold it. They did. Now try to hold it perfectly. Better, more efficiently. They couldn't, gasping for air. That's what you're doing with rest, trying to hold it, control it, perfect it. But breath happens naturally when you stop trying. Rest is the same. Soul flowing isn't something you do, it's something you allow. That afternoon, Ruth taught them the first principle of stopping, the holy pause. When you feel the urge to do, pause for 30 seconds, just 30. Don't pray, don't plan, just pause. Feel the discomfort of stillness. That discomfort, that's not sin, that's conditioning leaving your body. Margaret tried it, sitting in David's chair, hands empty, mind racing but body still. 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes. But at second 28, something shifted. For 2 seconds, she wasn't grinding. She was just being. It wasn't much, But it was a start. That, Ruth said softly, is your first taste of soul flowing. Tomorrow, we'll make it a minute. Spiritual growth after 50 isn't about going faster, it's about finally learning to stop. Would you like me to continue with chapter 11? Or would you like any adjustments to these chapters? Chapter 11. First day of rest. The miracle happened on a Tuesday at 3:47 a.m. Margaret didn't wake up. She slept through her body's alarm clock for the first time in 2 years, not stirring until 8:17 when actual sunlight touched her face. The disorientation was profound. She'd missed the anxiety hour, missed the chest pains, missed the performance of pre-dawn spirituality. She'd simply slept, and the world hadn't ended. That's what biblical rest for women looks like, Ruth said when Margaret called her, voice thick with wonder and confusion. Not perfect, not scheduled, just received. Your body knew what to do once your soul stopped fighting it. Margaret could hear Ruth's smile through the phone. Now, don't you dare feel guilty. Don't you dare make a list. Just sit with the miracle of having rested without earning it. That's soul-flowing grace with skin on. But here's what nobody tells Christian women over 50. Rest can be terrifying when you've used exhaustion as identity. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, no agenda, no urgency, and felt like she was dissolving. Without her to-do list, who was she? Without everyone needing her, did she matter? The questions rose like tide, threatening to drown this fragile peace. Then she remembered Ruth's words. The discomfort isn't the rest, it's the resistance leaving. Sarah texted at noon. Mom, you didn't send your morning check-in. Are you okay? Margaret stared at the message, realizing she'd trained everyone to expect her constant availability. Her fingers trembled as she typed back, I'm more than okay. I'm resting. Sarah's response was immediate. Finally, Dad would be so proud. The mention of David didn't sting like usual. Instead, Margaret felt him somehow, like he was smiling from whatever glory looked like. That afternoon, instead of her usual 17 tasks, Margaret did one thing. She sat in David's garden and watched the roses he'd planted bloom without her help. They didn't need her anxiety to grow. They didn't need her grinding to be beautiful. They just needed sun, water, and time. Is that what you've been trying to tell me? She whispered to the sky. The answer came not in words but in feeling loosening in her chest, like roots finally finding water after drought. She didn't pray formally, didn't open her Bible, didn't perform any spiritual disciplines. She just sat in the garden David loved, practicing the morning routine with God that wasn't routine at all, just presence, just breathing, just flowing with the rhythm of grace that had been waiting for her all along. You're having a breakdown, Sarah announced, standing in Margaret's doorway 3 days later. Her professional suit, sharp as her accusation. You missed the church board meeting. You haven't answered 43 emails. Mrs. Patterson says you refused to lead the prayer chain. This isn't rest, Mom, this is depression. The words were arrows, each one finding its mark in Margaret's newfound peace. Margaret felt the old familiar pull to justify, to explain, to resume the grinding that everyone expected. But Ruth's voice echoed from yesterday's conversation. When you start soul flowing, the world will call it selfish. They need you to stay exhausted because your exhaustion enables their avoidance. Margaret looked at her daughter, really looked, and saw her own former self polished, productive, and dying inside. I'm not having a breakdown, sweetheart. I'm having a breakthrough. But I understand why that scares you. Scares me. Sarah's voice cracked, professional facade slipping. You're acting like Dad before. She stopped, hand flying to her mouth. The unfinished sentence hung between them like a revelation. David had started changing before his death, had started saying no, started resting, started flowing. They'd all thought he was giving up. Now Margaret understood he'd been letting go different entirely. Sarah crumbled onto the couch, her power suit wrinkling. I can't do this without you being the strong one, she admitted. If you stop holding everything together, what happens to the rest of us? The question was raw, honest, and exactly what Margaret had feared. But Ruth had prepared her for this. Your exhaustion has become their excuse. When you stop grinding, they'll have to face their own refusal to flow. Margaret sat beside her daughter, taking her manicured hands. What happens is, you learn to hold yourself. What happens is, the family discovers they're stronger than they knew. What happens is we all stop using faith-based productivity as a substitute for actual faith. She pulled out David's hidden journal, showing Sarah an entry. I've been everyone's strength for so long, they've never developed their own. My grinding has stunted their growth. My exhaustion has enabled their immaturity. If I love them, I have to stop being their God. Sarah wept then, the kind of tears that come when truth finally breaks through performance. I wake at 3:47 because that's when the anxiety tells me I'm not enough, she confessed. Just like you. Just like Dad probably did. Margaret held her daughter. Both of them crying. Both of them breaking. Both of them finally ready to learn what finding purpose after 50 really meant, not doing more, but allowing others to do their part. This is why positive thinking is spiritual bypass, Margaret said, remembering Ruth's controversial words. We need to feel the fear of doing less, before we can discover the freedom of flowing more. Tomorrow, you join Ruth and me for morning prayer. Not to do anything. Just to learn how to stop doing everything. There remains a rest for the people of God. Ruth read from Hebrews 4, her voice carrying ancient authority in the pre-dawn sanctuary. The Greek word is sabbatismos, not just rest, but a perpetual Sabbath state. God isn't calling you to rest occasionally. He's calling you to live rested. That's soul flowing. The candles flickered as if in agreement, casting dancing shadows on Margaret and Sarah's faces. Ruth continued, her interpretation revolutionary. It says we must strive to enter that rest. Strive to rest sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? But here's what Christian women over 50 miss. The striving isn't to earn rest, it's to resist the world's demand that we keep grinding. Spiritual warfare isn't fighting demons, it's fighting the belief that our worth comes from our exhaustion. Biblical rest for women is actually a battle cry. Margaret felt something shift tectonically in her understanding. She'd always read Hebrews 4 as another standard she was failing to meet. But Ruth was revealing it as a promise she'd been failing to receive. The rest of God isn't a reward for the faithful, it's the evidence of faith. When you rest, you're declaring that God is God and you're not. That's the most radical spiritual productivity possible. You're actually more powerful at rest than you've ever been in motion. Sarah interrupted, her voice urgent, but my work, I have 3 cases going to trial. I can't just rest. Ruth's response was gentle but devastating. Child, you're about to learn what your father learned. You can't afford not to rest. Your cases will win or lose based on God's sovereignty, not your anxiety. Your grinding is actually faithlessness, dressed up as responsibility. When you truly believe God is in control, rest becomes the most logical response. The revelation continued unfolding. Jesus said it is finished, and then rested. Not it will be finished if you work hard enough. It is finished. Your salvation, your worth, your purpose finished. You're not grinding toward completion. You're grinding away from it. Soul flowing means living from the finished work, not for it. Ruth closed the Bible, looked directly at them. This is why you wake at 3:47. Your souls know this truth, but your minds keep fighting it. Today, you stop fighting. Today, you enter the rest that's been waiting for you since before time began. Not because you've earned it, but because Jesus did. That's the scandal of grace. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks, not sadness, but relief so profound it needed to leak out. She'd been trying to finish what was already finished, earn what was already given, become what she already was. The 5 a.m. prayer routine she'd been attempting wasn't about doing more, it was about remembering what was already done. This changes everything, she whispered. Ruth smiled. No, honey, it changes nothing except your perspective. The rest has always been there. You're just finally tired enough to enter it. Welcome to the real morning routine with God, where you don't bring your productivity, you bring your emptiness, and He fills it with His finished work. 3 weeks into soul flowing, Margaret noticed something strange. She had energy at 2 p.m. Not the frantic, caffeinated push she'd relied on for years, but actual, sustainable life force. She was in David's garden, not working but observing, when she realized she'd been awake since 6 a.m. without exhaustion. The energy wasn't explosive. It was gentle, like morning sun through gauze curtains, warming without burning. That's what happens when you stop leaking power through anxiety, Ruth explained, finding Margaret among the roses. You've been hemorrhaging energy for 2 years, trying to hold the world together. Now that you've let go, your body's remembering how to hold energy instead of spending it. She touched a rose that had bloomed overnight. See, it doesn't strain to bloom. It just receives what it needs and naturally unfolds. That's you now, not forcing, just flowing. Sarah arrived with news. I won the Morrison case, the one I was so anxious about. I prepared less than ever, but I was more present, more clear. It was like the arguments flowed through me instead of from me. She looked confused and amazed simultaneously. Is this what Dad felt his last months? This ease. Margaret nodded, understanding now why David's final season had seemed so luminous despite his declining health. He'd discovered soul-flowing secret. Energy isn't generated by doing more, but by resisting less. Jennifer, Margaret's online prayer partner, had started joining their 5 a.m. gatherings virtually. Her message that afternoon confirmed what Margaret was experiencing. Since practicing biblical rest, I have energy for my grandkids again. Not the forced enthusiasm I was faking, but real joy. My daughter asked if I was on new medication. I said yes, it's called soul flowing, and the side effects include peace, clarity, and the energy of a woman half my age. She thinks I've joined a cult. They laughed, but it was true. Finding purpose after 50 through rest instead of grinding did seem cult-like to a world addicted to exhaustion. That evening, Margaret did something she hadn't done in 2 years. She danced. Alone in her kitchen, to David's favorite song. She moved with an energy that wasn't manufactured or forced. It rose from somewhere deep, like an underground spring finally reaching surface. Her body, freed from the constant tension of trying, remembered how to flow. The dance wasn't perfect or pretty. It was better. It was real. Through the window she caught Ruth watching from across the street, smiling and raising a cup of tea in salute. This was energy returned, not the harsh electricity of anxiety, but the gentle current of a soul, finally flowing with God's rhythm, instead of against it. Tomorrow, she would share this dance with others, teaching what spiritual growth after 50 really looked like. Not climbing mountains, but learning to flow like water, finding the path of least resistance to grace. I want to help with the food bank, Margaret announced at the church office, surprising everyone, including herself. But this desire felt different. Not obligation or guilt, but genuine overflow. Like a cup filled to brimming that naturally spills over. Pastor Jim's eyebrows shot up. Margaret, are you sure? You've been resting. The way he said resting sounded like backsliding, but Margaret didn't flinch. I'm serving from overflow now, not deficit, she explained, the words coming from some deep knowing. For 2 years, I served from empty, giving what I didn't have. Now, I have something real to give. She could see the confusion in their faces. How could doing less result in having more? But Ruth had explained it perfectly. A well doesn't generate water, it allows water to flow through it. When you're grinding, you're a blocked well. When you're flowing, you become a source. The food bank shift felt completely different. Instead of the familiar exhaustion-tinged resentment, Margaret felt joy. Real joy, not the performed kind. She found herself singing while sorting cans, not because she should, but because song was rising from somewhere deep. Mrs. Patterson, perpetual critic, noticed. Margaret Robertson, you're glowing. What's your secret? Margaret's answer was simple. I learned to stop pouring from empty. This is soul-flowing, serving from abundance instead of anxiety. Sarah watched her mother that evening, preparing dinner with ease instead of exhaustion. You're different, Mom. Not just rested, transformed. Margaret considered this. Hands working with rhythm, instead of rush. I spent 56 years believing service meant sacrifice, that giving meant depleting. But overcoming burnout as a Christian means discovering that God never asked for my exhaustion. He asked for my availability. There's a difference. Jennifer's text arrived during dinner. Taught my first soul-flowing workshop today. 12 women, all over 50, all exhausted from grinding. When I explained serving from overflow, one woman burst into tears and said, "You mean God doesn't need my exhaustion as proof of love?" That's when I knew this message matters. Margaret felt it too. This wasn't just personal healing. This was a movement waiting to happen. A revolution of rest for Christian women over 50 who'd been taught that depletion was devotion. Tomorrow, she would write about it, sharing what faith-based productivity really meant, not producing more, but flowing from fullness. David's journal had been right. The world didn't need more exhausted servants. It needed flowing souls who served from the abundance of rest. Margaret laughed at breakfast, not the polite chuckle she'd performed for 2 years, but a real belly-deep laugh that surprised everyone, including herself. Sarah had spilled coffee while telling a story, and instead of immediately cleaning it up with familiar anxiety, Margaret just laughed. The joy wasn't manufactured or mandatory. It bubbled up naturally, like springs in the desert Ruth kept mentioning. "That's what Martha missed," Ruth said later, referring to the biblical sisters. She thought joy came from perfect service. But Mary knew joy came from presence. You Christian women over 50 have been Martha so long, you've forgotten Mary's secret. Joy isn't produced, it's received. When you stop pressuring yourself to be joyful, joy finally has room to appear. The controversy of defending Martha while validating Mary felt revolutionary. Sarah confronted her that afternoon. "Mom, you're actually happy. Not pretending, not performing, actually happy. How?" Margaret considered the question, realizing she hadn't thought about happiness in weeks. She'd been too busy, or rather, too unbusy flowing. "I stopped trying to manufacture joy and started allowing it," she said. "Soul flowing taught me that joy without pressure is the only real joy. Everything else is performance anxiety dressed in church clothes." The truth was scandalous in its simplicity. When Margaret stopped demanding joy from herself, it arrived uninvited. When she stopped performing happiness for others, genuine contentment emerged. Her morning routine with God had transformed from desperate petition to gentle reception. She wasn't begging for joy anymore. She was simply available to it. The difference was everything. Even her face had changed, the permanent worry lines softening, the fake smile replaced with authentic peace. That evening, going through David's things finally, she found another hidden note. "Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm gone but not lost. The last 6 months, I discovered joy without pressure, through soul flowing. Not the joy of achievement or approval, but the joy of just being alive in God's presence. It's like breathing. The moment you stop trying, it happens naturally. Stop trying so hard to be happy, love. Just flow, and happiness will find you." Margaret held the note to her chest, feeling David's presence not as grief, but as gift. He'd found it before he left, this secret of spiritual growth after 50. Joy wasn't a reward for good behavior or perfect faith. It was the natural state of a soul at rest. Tomorrow, she would teach this to others, showing them how biblical rest for women included the radical act of being happy without reason, joyful without justification, flowing with the pleasure of simply existing in grace. "I need to apologize," Sarah said, arriving unannounced on a Thursday evening. Her usual armor of professional attire replaced with jeans and one of David's old t-shirts she'd claimed after the funeral. "I've been using you as my emotional support system while resenting you for having needs. Dad saw it. That's why he started pulling back, wasn't it? To force us all to grow up." Margaret felt the old pattern rising. Comfort Sarah, minimize the hurt, perform the perfect mother. But soul flowing had taught her something different. "Yes," she said simply, "your father saw how our codependence was killing both of us. His rest wasn't abandonment, it was love." Sarah flinched at the honesty but didn't retreat. This was healing, messy, uncomfortable, real. The Martha vindication, Ruth had called it that morning. Martha was right to want help. Mary was right to choose presence. Here's the scripture that proves both are needed for true spiritual productivity. Martha. Martha, Jesus said, not rejecting her service, but her anxiety about it. He wanted her to serve from rest, not rest from service. That's what relationships need, people flowing together, not grinding against each other. Sarah pulled out her phone, showing Margaret something unprecedented, a blank calendar for Sunday. I'm learning to rest, too. My marriage is failing because I've been grinding so hard. There's nothing left for Tom. He said I'm just like you. We're giving everyone my exhaustion and calling it love. The words stung with truth. Margaret saw the generational pattern clearly. Now women teaching daughters that love meant depletion, that relationships required self-erasure. That night, they did something they hadn't done since before David's death. They talked without agenda. No problems to solve, no crises to manage. Just two women learning to relate without performing. Sarah confessed her terror of turning 50, of becoming invisible. Margaret shared her discovery that finding purpose after 50 meant becoming visible to yourself first. They cried, but differently, not from pain but from recognition. Like exiles hearing their native language after years abroad. Jennifer joined them virtually, adding her own revelation. My husband said I'm easier to love now that I've stopped trying so hard to be lovable. Soul flowing is healing marriages, friendships, families, not by doing more but by forcing everyone to show up authentically instead of functionally. Margaret felt it too. Relationships, healing not through effort but through rest. Connections deepening not through grinding but through flowing together in the same direction. Tomorrow, she would call her other children, not to manage or fix, but simply to be present. This was the morning routine with God that changed everything, learning to relate from rest, love from overflow, and trust that relationships, like roses, grow better with space than suffocation. The email arrived at 3:47 a.m., not waking Margaret anymore, but waiting for her when she rose naturally at 6. Please teach us what you're learning, wrote Jennifer. Ceasing 12 other women from their online prayer group. We're all exhausted from grinding. We need soul flowing. Margaret stared at the request, feeling both unqualified and undeniably called. She wasn't a teacher anymore, hadn't led anything since David's death. But Ruth's words echoed, "You teach best what you most needed to learn." The first gathering was awkward. 7 women in Margaret's living room, all over 50, all wearing their exhaustion like badges of honor. Margaret didn't have a curriculum, just her story. I collapsed on my kitchen floor 8 weeks ago, she began. At 3:47 a.m., same time my husband's heart stopped. I thought I was dying. Turns out, I was. The old me, the grinding, performing, never resting me needed to die for the flowing me to be born. Barbara, the pastor's wife, shifted uncomfortably. But the church needs. Margaret's interruption was gentle but firm. The church needs healthy women, not martyrs. What we've been calling faith-based productivity is actually faith-based destruction. We're teaching our daughters that God requires their exhaustion. That's not gospel, that's heresy. The room went silent, the controversy landing like lightning. But in their eyes, Margaret saw recognition, not resistance. Ruth arrived halfway through, as if summoned by the honesty in the room. "Ah, the soul-flowing sisterhood begins," she said, settling into David's chair like she belonged there. "Let me tell you what Christian women over 50 need to know. Your exhaustion isn't making God proud, it's making him sad. He created Sabbath before sin entered the world. Rest isn't repair from fallenness, it's part of perfection. When you refuse to rest, you're saying God's design is flawed." By evening, something had shifted. These women, teachers, nurses, mothers, grandmothers, began sharing their own 3:47 a.m. stories. Each had a breaking point, a moment when grinding became impossible. Patricia confessed to anxiety medication she'd hidden for years. Dorothy admitted she fantasized about disappearing. Linda revealed she hadn't felt joy since turning 50. These weren't weak women, they were warriors who'd been fighting the wrong battle. The real war, Ruth said, isn't against laziness. It's against the lie that we have to earn our worth through exhaustion. Margaret gave them homework, not another task but an untask. This week, disappoint someone. Say no to something that would normally be yes. Feel the discomfort of not being needed. That's where soul flowing begins, in the space between who you've been forced to be and who you actually are. They left differently than they'd arrived, lighter, like prisoners who'd just discovered the door was never locked. Jennifer's text that night summed it up. We're starting a revolution, aren't we? A revolution of rest. Margaret knew she was right. Finding purpose after 50 wasn't about doing more, it was about teaching others to finally, blessedly do less. Margaret's days had developed a pattern, not rigid routine but organic rhythm, like breathing or seasons. She woke when her body was ready, prayed when her soul felt moved, served when her cup overflowed. The transformation was so complete that when she ran into Pastor Jim at the grocery store, he didn't recognize her at first. "Margaret, you look different, younger. What happened?" "Soul flowing happened," she said simply, no longer feeling the need to explain or defend. The morning routine with God she'd tried to force for decades had finally arrived, not through discipline but through surrender. She didn't wake at 3:47 anymore. That desperate hour had served its purpose, breaking her open for grace. Now she woke with the sun, naturally, peacefully, ready instead of racing. Sarah called with news. "I quit the partnership track. Took a council position instead. Less money, less prestige. But Tom and I are actually talking again. Really talking. He said I'm becoming the woman he married, not the machine I'd turned into." The parallel was clear. Both mother and daughter, discovering that spiritual growth after 50, were approaching it. Meant trading routine for rhythm, performance for presence. Ruth's teaching that week went deeper. Routine is what you impose on life. Rhythm is what emerges from life. Routine is mechanical, same actions, same time, regardless of season. Rhythm is organic, responsive, adaptive, alive. Jesus didn't have a routine. He had rhythm, sometimes praying all night, sometimes sleeping through storms. He flowed with the Father's rhythm, not a religious schedule. That's your model. The evidence was everywhere. Margaret's garden thrived with less tending but more attention. Her prayers became conversations instead of presentations. Her service felt like dancing instead of marching. Even her body responded. The chest pains gone, the insomnia resolved, her blood pressure normal for the first time since David's death. The doctor was baffled. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." But that was the secret. She wasn't doing. She was being. That evening, organizing David's study finally, Margaret found his final journal entry, dated the morning of his death. "Today feels different. Not ominous, just complete. Like I've finally learned the rhythm God's been teaching." Soul flowing isn't a practice to master, but a rhythm to receive. Maggie will find this someday, when she's ready to stop marching and start dancing. The 5 a.m. prayer routine isn't about the time, it's about the rhythm. Any time becomes sacred when you're flowing with God instead of grinding for Him. If this is my last day, I'm ready. Not because I've done enough, but because I've finally learned to flow. Margaret held the journal to her chest, tears falling freely. David had found it, the secret rhythm of finding purpose after 50. Not a new routine to perfect, but an ancient rhythm to remember. Tomorrow would bring its own rhythm, and she would flow with it, not force it. This was biblical rest for women, not static but flowing, not routine but rhythm, not death but dance. Time had changed texture. What used to blur past in anxious rushing now moved like honey, golden, slow, sweet. Margaret could sit for an hour watching clouds, feeling no guilt, no urgency, just presence. This wasn't depression or resignation. It was depth, like switching from skimming surfaces to deep-sea diving. Life had slowed, but paradoxically, she was experiencing more life than ever. "This is what mystics know," Ruth explained during their morning gathering, now grown to 15 women. "When you slow down enough, you start seeing what's actually there. The burning bush was always burning. Moses just finally stood still long enough to notice. Your 3:47 a.m. wake-ups were your burning bush. But you were too busy putting out fires to see the invitation to holy ground. Sarah had started attending regularly, bringing 2 colleagues who'd noticed her transformation. My whole department is asking what happened to me, she shared. I told them about soul flowing, about finding purpose after 50 or before through rest instead of achievement. My boss said it sounds like laziness. I said no, it's the opposite. It takes more faith to rest than to grind. Grinding is control. Rest is trust. The depth was revealing things Margaret had missed while racing. She noticed how the light changed throughout the day, how her breath naturally synced with ocean rhythms though she lived inland, how David's presence wasn't gone but transformed from physical to mystical, still real, just different. Her faith, no longer frantic, had roots now, going deep instead of spreading thin. She could feel God in mundane moments. Washing dishes became meditation, folding laundry became prayer. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Hidden in David's desk, beneath financial papers, was a leather journal she'd never seen. The cover read, "Soul Flowing, a manual for Maggie." Inside, David had spent his final months documenting everything, his journey from grinding to flowing, specific practices, prayers, revelations. Page 1 began, "My beloved Maggie, if you're reading this, you've finally slowed down enough to find it. This isn't goodbye, it's hello to who you really are when you stop performing. Soul flowing saved my last months, transformed my dying into living. Now it's your turn." Margaret spent the day reading, time stopping completely, as David's voice echoed through his handwriting. He'd discovered soul flowing through his own collapse, a minor heart attack she'd never known about. 3 years before his death, he'd hidden it, not wanting to worry her, but it had initiated his transformation. "I realized," he wrote, "that I'd been racing toward death, thinking it was life. So I stopped racing, started flowing, and found more life in slowing down than I'd ever found in speeding up." Christian women over 50 need to know this secret. The second half of life isn't about doing more, but about being more. Depth over distance, presence over productivity, flow over force. Margaret closed the journal, understanding finally why David's death had been so peaceful. He hadn't been taken mid-race, he'd crossed the finish line in perfect rhythm. Tomorrow, she would share his manual with the others, teaching what spiritual growth after 50 really meant. Not climbing higher but diving deeper, not racing faster but flowing slower, not faith as achievement but faith as immersion. At 5 a.m., exactly 12 weeks after her kitchen floor collapse, Margaret stood in the sanctuary teaching 23 women about soul flowing. The woman in the mirror that morning had been unrecognizable, not younger exactly, but undeniably alive. Gray hair worn proudly, face unmasked by exhaustion, eyes clear with purpose that wasn't performed but possessed. She'd become someone she'd never been before, perhaps. Finally become who she'd always been beneath the grinding. "Identity after 50 isn't about reinvention," she began. David's manual opened beside her. "It's about resurrection. The you that was buried under decades of shoulds and must-she's, still there, waiting to flow." She shared David's most profound discovery. We think aging means diminishing. But spiritual aging means distilling, becoming more essentially ourselves, less diluted by others' expectations. Soul flowing accelerates this distillation. Barbara, the pastor's wife who'd been most resistant, stood unexpectedly. "I need to confess something. I'm 62 and I've been pretending to be 50, trying to maintain the energy of youth instead of embracing the wisdom of age. Last week, I stopped dyeing my hair. My husband said I looked like myself for the first time in years. That's when I understood finding purpose after 50 isn't about staying young. It's about becoming ancient in the best way. Wise, rooted, real." Ruth added her revelation. In Scripture, God calls himself Ancient of Days, not forever young. Ancient is holy. Slowing down is sacred. When Christian women over 50 embrace their age instead of fighting it, they become like God, ancient, patient, flowing with eternal rhythm, instead of temporal panic. That's your new identity, not human doings, but human beings, created in the image of the Ancient of Days. Sarah's announcement stunned everyone. I'm pregnant. The room erupted in joy, but she continued. At 32, I'm terrified of becoming a mother while working. But watching Mom transform through soul flowing, I realized I don't have to grind through motherhood. I can flow through it. This baby is already teaching me about biblical rest for women. Pregnancy forces you to slow down, to grow something through being, not doing. Margaret felt the complete circle from her collapse to Sarah's creation. From death to life, from grinding to flowing. Her identity had completely transformed. She wasn't David's widow anymore. She was Margaret, flowing soul, wisdom keeper, rest, revolutionary. The 3:47 a.m. wake-ups had been labor pains, birthing who she was meant to be in the second half of life. This is what David knew, she said, holding up his journal. Our new identity after 50 isn't about what we accomplish, but about what we allow. Not about what we produce, but about what we release. We become rivers, not dams flowing with divine current instead of generating our own power. The 5 a.m. prayer routine had become something else entirely, not routine but ritual. Not discipline but devotion. Not performance but presence. They were becoming who they'd always been, just too busy to notice. The sanctuary was full not for service, but for celebration. 3 months since Margaret's collapse, the soul-flowing movement had grown to 47 women, all over 50, all recovering from spiritual exhaustion. They called themselves the 5 a.m. Sisters, though they rarely met at 5 anymore. The time had become symbolic, representing not when they met, but how they lived, flowing with divine rhythm instead of racing against time. Margaret stood before them, David's journal in one hand, her own newly started journal in the other. 12 weeks ago, I was dying at 3:47 every morning. Now I'm living at whatever time grace wakes me. This isn't a success story, it's a resurrection story. And every one of you is living your own resurrection through soul flowing. The testimonies flowed like water. Patricia had reduced her anxiety medication by half. Dorothy's marriage was healing after 20 years of distance. Linda had started painting again, talent dormant since her 20s. Jennifer was teaching soul-flowing workshops online, reaching hundreds. Sarah, showing now, had negotiated a flexible work arrangement that honored both career and coming motherhood. Each story was different, but the theme was identical. When grinding stopped, life started. Ruth, now 73, stood for the final blessing. What we've discovered isn't new, it's ancient. God established rest before work, being before doing, Sabbath before service. We just forgot. But forgetting isn't failure, it's human. And remembering, that's divine. Christian women over 50, you've been invited to the great flowing, the divine rhythm that runs beneath all the world's noise. Your 3:47 wake-ups weren't curses, they were invitations to this moment. Margaret opened David's final entry. Dated the morning he died, reading aloud. Soul flowing isn't a program to complete, but a river to enter. You don't master it, you surrender to it. And in that surrender, you find what all the grinding couldn't give: peace that surpasses understanding. Joy without reason, purpose without pressure. If you're reading this, you're ready. Step into the flow. The river's been waiting for you all along. The invitation extended beyond that room, reaching every exhausted soul watching. Margaret looked directly at the camera Jennifer had set up. If you're waking at 3:47, if you're grinding instead of flowing, if you're a Christian woman over 50 who's tired of being tired, this is your invitation. Soul flowing isn't another thing to add to your list. It's permission to burn the list. It's not about finding your morning routine with God, but about letting God find you in your exhaustion and teach you to flow. Comment soul flowing if you're ready to stop grinding. Share this with every woman who needs to know that finding purpose after 50 doesn't mean doing more, it means finally, blessedly, flowing with the current that's been carrying you all along, even when you were swimming against it. 1 year later, the movement had spread like water, finding its level. The 5 a.m. Sisters had become a global network, not an organization, but an organism. growing naturally wherever exhausted souls recognized their reflection in Margaret's story. Churches that once celebrated grinding now taught flowing. Women who'd worn exhaustion as honor now wore rest as worship. Margaret stood in the same sanctuary, now teaching teachers. Soul flowing isn't mine or David's, it's ancient as Eden, when God rested not from exhaustion, but from completion. We're not spreading a program but remembering a promise that rest isn't earned but inherited, not achieved but received. The room held 200 women, each carrying the message to their own communities like seeds on wind. Sarah, holding baby David, spoke to the gathering. My mother's collapse saved my life. I was racing toward my own 3:47 a.m. crisis when her transformation interrupted my trajectory. Watching her move from grinding to flowing taught me that strength isn't about holding everything together, it's about knowing when to let go. This baby, she lifted little David, will grow up knowing that rest is holy, that flowing is faithful, that spiritual productivity means producing space for God to work, not working to produce for God. She continued, my father knew this secret before he died. He tried to teach us, but we weren't ready to learn. We thought his slowing down was giving up. Now I understand he was speeding up in the only direction that matters, deeper into God's rhythm. Mom's journey from burnout to biblical rest didn't just heal her, it healed our entire family tree, breaking generational patterns of grinding that we'd called faithfulness. Ruth, now leading the movement alongside Margaret, presented the challenge, 90 days, that's what we're asking. The same 90 days the doctor gave Margaret to change or face David's fate. But instead of adding disciplines, we're subtracting them. For 90 days, practice one thing, disappointing someone daily by saying no. Rest without guilt every Sabbath. Replace your 5 a.m. anxiety with 5 a.m. availability, not to do but to be. The challenge was simple but revolutionary. Stop grinding for 90 days. Practice soul flowing instead. Wake when your body wakes. Pray when your soul moves. Serve from overflow only. Rest without justification. Watch what happens when you stop holding the world together and discover it doesn't fall apart. It actually starts flowing better without your anxious management. Margaret held David's journal one final time, reading his prophecy that had come true. One day, Maggie will teach thousands what I'm only learning now, that the second half of life isn't about slowing down, but about flowing with. That finding purpose after 50 means discovering you've been swimming upstream your whole life, and rest is just turning around and floating with the current that's been trying to carry you home all along. The promise was specific. When you answer the 3:47 a.m. call with soul flowing instead of anxiety, when you replace grinding with flowing, when you choose biblical rest over religious performance, everything changes. Not because you've finally done enough, but because you've finally stopped trying to be God. Energy returns, joy resurfaces, relationships heal, purpose clarifies. Not through doing more, but through being more present, more available, more flowing with divine rhythm. The camera pulled back to reveal the full sanctuary, hundreds of women, all over 50, all glowing with a particular luminosity of souls at rest. They weren't praying formally. They were simply being breathing, present, flowing. Margaret's voiceover concluded, 2 years ago, I collapsed on my kitchen floor at 3:47 a.m., convinced I was dying. I was right, the grinding me died that night, but the flowing me was born. David was right, soul. Flowing isn't something you master. It's something you enter, like a river that's always been flowing, waiting for you to stop fighting the current. The final image, Margaret in her garden at dawn, not working but witnessing the roses David planted blooming without her help. Sarah beside her, baby David sleeping peacefully. Ruth approaching with coffee. The 5 a.m. sisters gathering, not for desperate prayer but for gentle presence. The clock visible through the window showing 5 a.m., but nobody checking it. They'd learned to flow with time, instead of racing against it. This is soul flowing, Margaret's voice concluded. This is finding purpose after 50. This is your morning routine with God. Not another discipline to master, but a rhythm to receive. The river's flowing. The invitation stands. Step in, float, flow, live. Your 347 wake up isn't a curse, it's calling you home to who you've always been beneath all that grinding. Welcome to the Soul Flowing Sisterhood. We've been waiting for you. Text appears on screen. Join 10,000 women over 50 who've stopped grinding and started flowing. Comment Soul Flowing below. Share with every exhausted soul you know. The revolution of rest begins with you.